From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
There is a change in the program. Dr. Levon Avdoyan will not be able to moderate the panel. He's just had a flu. And so I invited Dr. Marius Dieb, my husband, to come and moderate this panel. Marius Dieb holds a BA and MA from American University of Beirut and a doctorate from Oxford University. He has written extensively and is writing a book on Eastern Christians of the Near East going back 2,000 years. So it was fitting that he should moderate this panel on Assyrians and birth of Christianity. So now we need the speakers on this panel to join us, and they will be introduced.
I'll follow exactly the order which is in the panel, starting with Dr. Mark Dickens, which is the panel is, of course, as you know, composes of 3 panelists. Mark Dickens is at King's University, Edmonton, Alberta, and former Killam postdoctoral fellow in the Religious Studies program at the University of Alberta, where he taught also. His he researches the connection between Syriac Christianity and Central Asia, including materials on Turks found in Syriac sources. He was part of the research team at SOAS, School of Advanced International Studies, School of Oriental African Studies, University of London, that worked on Syriac materials from Western China and co-authored Syriac manuscripts from the Berlin Turfan collection. So, Professor Dickens.
Thank you very much. There we go. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak at this symposium. This talk will focus on a time when the Church of the East, which is the name I will use to refer to what is now known as the Assyrian Church of the East, was not a national church, but rather an international church. I'd like to start with a quotation from Patriarch Timothy I, here writing in 792 or 93 to the monks of the monastery of Mar Maron, the modern Maronites. For behold, in all the lands of Babel, Baghdad, Pars, Persia, and Athur, Assyria, Beth Athur, and in all of the eastern lands and amongst Beth Hinduaya, the Indians, and indeed amongst Beth Sinaya, the Chinese, amongst Beth Tuktaya, the Tibetans, and likewise amongst Beth Turkaya, the Turks, and in all the domains under this patriarchal throne, that one who is this hypostasis, in other words, Christ, is proclaimed indeed in different and diverse lands and races and languages. So in this talk, we'll travel east to Central Asia, looking at places and peoples under the patriarchal throne of the Church of the East between the 2nd and the 15th centuries. Central Asia is sandwiched between Iran, India, China, and Russia, comprises the modern territories of northern Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Xinjiang, and Inner Mongolia, both of the latter 2 in China, and many scholars would include Mongolia with that as well. Central Asia includes some of the tallest mountains in the world, bounded as it is to the south by the Hindu Kush, Pamir, Karakoram, and Kunlun mountain ranges, as well as the Tian Shan range that divides the former Soviet Central Asia from Chinese Central Asia. Contains a huge variety of landforms, including some of the most awe-inspiring vistas in the world, like here the Orkhon Valley in Mongolia, the original homeland of the Turkic peoples. It also comprises some of the harshest deserts and lowest depressions on Earth, places like the Gobi Desert in Mongolia, the Turfan Depression, and the forbidding Taklamakan Desert in western China. Although there are places where adequate water supply and good soils make agriculture possible, the economy has typically been based on pastoral nomadism and transcontinental commerce along the trade network now called the Silk Road. Silk Road refers to a network of trade routes connecting China with the Mediterranean via Central Asia. Heading west through the Gansu or Heshi corridor, it splits into 3 branches at the eastern end of the Tarim Basin. 2 routes skirt the Taklamakan Desert, meeting up at Kashgar in the west, from whence various routes lead or led south and west. The Silk Road was actually the core of the extensive transcontinental and indeed intercontinental trade which took place during antiquity and the Middle Ages, enabling not only goods like silk, horses, slaves, glass, and paper, but also art, technology, philosophy, and religion to travel between Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Central Asia has historically been home to speakers of Indo-European, Turkic, or Mongolic languages. By way of example, this linguistic diversity can be seen in the 20-plus languages and 20-plus scripts found at Turfan in China, including here examples of Sogdian, Mongolian, Middle Persian in the Manichaean script, Bactrian in the Hephthalite script, and Khotanese in the Brahmi script, shown in this slide. Central Asia is also religiously diverse. Native to the area are both Zoroastrianism and animism or shamanism. Those are both problematic terms from an academic perspective, but useful nonetheless. Practiced by the Iranian-speaking and the Turkic or Mongolian-speaking peoples, respectively. 4 major missionary religions were introduced into Central Asia along the Silk Road network. Buddhism from India and Manichaeism from Iran, in addition to Christianity and Islam, of course, both of which we'll be discussing in this talk. It was from Persia that Syriac Christianity spread eastward into Central Asia. Our first references come from Bardaeuson's Book of the Laws of Countries, from about the year 196, which mentions Christians in Beth Kashan, which refers to the Kushan Empire in Bactria, northern Afghanistan, present in the 1st and 2nd century. The Syriac book, The Doctrine of the Apostles, written probably about 250, mentions countries in the east being evangelized by Agai, very well known in the Church of the East as sort of the original apostle, even as far as, quote, the land of Gog and Magog. But no specific location is given. You can see a map there where Gog and Magog are in the lower corner behind the mountains that have entrapped them. More tangibly, the Synodicon Orientale of the Church of the East, Synod Records, informs us of bishops from Merv and Herat, now in Turkmenistan and Afghanistan, respectively, at the Synod of Dadisho in 424. Due to its location on the eastern flank of the Persian Empire, Merv was an extremely strategic city, first for the Persians and later for the Muslims. It was also a key staging post for missions sent out by the Church of the East into Central Asia. According to a legend extant in Syriac, Sogdian, and Christian Arabic texts, Christianity was established in Merv by Mar Barshaba. Here we see examples of his name used as a personal name in the Urgut inscriptions at the top. I'll talk more about that later, and found in several of the Christian manuscripts from Turfan. Merv and Herat continued to play vital roles in the growth and expansion of the Church of the East for centuries. Only a few Christian artifacts have been found in and around Merv. A large building excavated there called Kharoba Koshuk has been interpreted as a Christian church, but this is disputed by some. Cosmas Indicoplousti's Christian topography, written in the middle 6th century, describes Christian communities and clergy amongst the Bactrians and Huns, referring to the Hephthalites who ruled in the 5th and 6th centuries north and south of the Oxus or Amu Darya River, and you will see why I have a picture of Mar Awa, the Bishop of California, there right now. The biography of Mar Abba, this is the first patriarch by that name, Mar Abba I, describes how the Hephthalite ruler sent a Hephthalite Christian priest to Shah Khosrow I around 550, requesting that the patriarch Mar Abba ordain him as a bishop for the whole kingdom of the Hephthalites. The patriarch did this, and as the account says, joy increased amongst the people of the Lord. So the Hephthalite bishop's seat was probably in Badisi or Badghis, an important Hephthalite center now in northwest Afghanistan. It referred to in the Synod of Ishoyab I in 585, which also mentions for the first time a metropolitan in Herat. By this time, however, the Hephthalites had been conquered by the Persians and Turks. From Bactria, south of the Amu Darya, or the Oxus River, Christianity spread northward into Sogdia, or Sogdiana, the homeland of the Sogdians, speakers of an Eastern Middle Iranian language. The heartland of the Sogdians included the cities of Samarkand and Bukhara, but their cultural influence extended north into the Fergana Valley and to Chach, or Shash, the ancient name of Tashkent. Indeed, their influence spread along the trade routes into China. This mural from Afrasiab, the ancient site of Samarkand, now in Uzbekistan, dates from around the year 660 and depicts Sogdians, Turks, Koreans, Chinese, and others, very clearly showing the multicultural world that Central Asians lived in at that time. Now, one of the questions that we have is when did Samarkand receive a metropolitan, meaning an archbishop? Abdushobar Baricha's Nomokanon suggests several patriarchs who might have established a metropolitan for Samarkand, but they are either too early, coming from the 5th or 6th century, or too late, coming from the 8th century. By contrast, another Christian writer, Ibn at-Tayyib, says it took place during the Patriarchate of Ishoyab. Unfortunately, he doesn't tell us which of the three patriarchs by that name he means, but they all come from the 6th or 7th century, so we can assume it was during that time. Now, these were turbulent times, as we have the Eastern and Western Turkic Khaganates, the Chinese, the Persian Sasanian Empire, and then coming on the scene, the Arab Caliphate, all competing for power in the region of Central Asia. Around this time, the Byzantine author Theophylact Simakata mentions Turks captured by the Persians in the year 591, who had crosses tattooed on their foreheads by the advice of Christians to ward off the plague. Around the same time, we hear from the Syriac Khuzestan Chronicle about the conversion and baptism of a minor Turkic ruler and his army, somewhere around the year 644 by the Metropolitan of Merv. This was accompanied by a display of weather magic by Turkic priests. It's quite an interesting account. Now we come to the Shi'an stele, or the Nestorian stele as it's sometimes referred to, dated to 781. This records the mission of Alopen, dispatched by Patriarch Ishoyab II to China, and it would have traveled through Central Asia before arriving in China in 635. Most of the names in Syriac script on the stele are standard Syriac names. Adam, Ibrahim, Isaac, that sort of thing. But there are also several Middle Persian names that you can see on there, indicating that members of the mission were of Middle Persian background. By contrast, the donor of the stele, his father, his name was Yazbazid, a good Middle Persian name, and his father was from Balkh in Bactria. Another pillar found in China a little bit later from the 9th century describes a Christian community in the other capital of Luoyang. And here, based on the surnames, we know that all the people involved were from Sogdiana, from places like Bukhara and Samarkand. So the Arab conquest of the Persian Empire lasted really only a little bit over 2 decades until the death of Shah Yazdagar III in 651. It took much longer to bring Central Asia north of the Amu Darya under control. Turning first to Bukhara, Narshaki's History of Bukhara, which, by the way, was translated by Eden's late husband, Richard Fry, mentions a Christian church converted into a mosque after Arab forces captured Bukhara in 709. This image is actually of the mausoleum of the Samanids, an important Persian dynasty. We really don't have any Christian artifacts from that time from Bukhara. But we do have artifacts from a similar period from the 7th or 8th centuries from other places nearby, including this potsherd or Ostrakhan from Penjikent, which is now in Tajikistan. This has portions of Psalms 1 to 2 written on it in Syriac, but it's got spelling errors which indicate the scribe was probably a Sogdian speaker. And on the right, very interesting, a processional cross from Herat, or at least that mentions the Church of Herat, inscribed in Pahlavi or Middle Persian, and this can probably be dated to the mid-8th century. Speaking of Pahlavi, just very briefly, I'll mention India. There are a number of 9th century crosses in India with Middle Persian inscriptions, reminding us of the long ties between the Church of the East in the Persian Empire and in southern India. Returning to Central Asia, there's evidence of Christian adaptation to local Zoroastrian customs in the use of ossuaries to contain the bones of the deceased. And they've been discovered in various places, including this one from Afrasiab, in now modern-day Samarkand. Also of interest from the same period, about the 7th or 8th century, there are a large number of coins with crosses on them, that have been discovered in Samarkand, Bukhara, Tashkent, and elsewhere. And these suggest that there were Christian rulers at this time, both before and after the Arab invasion, since only rulers can mint coins. Also of Sogdian provenance are several silver plates with biblical scenes dating from between the 7th and the 10th centuries. These have been found up in the Ural region of what's now Russia. The one on the left probably depicts the siege of Jericho. The one on the right, with Syriac script written on it, shows scenes from the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. Well, the Umayyads, the first caliphate, were overthrown by the Abbasids in 750. The Abbasids then went on to defeat the Chinese at the Battle of Talas in what's now Kyrgyzstan in 751. Thereby securing control of Central Asia for some time until the 9th century, when things began to break down and other dynasties arose. And so now we've gotten back to the time of Timothy I, and just revisiting the letter I mentioned earlier, there's 2 letters in which he mentions the Turks. In the first, from 782 to 83, he refers to the king of the Turkaya, who, along with most of his territory, has become acquainted with Christianity, and the fact that this king has asked for a metropolitan to be appointed. In his second letter, written 10 years after that, 792, Timothy speaks there of the Spirit having anointed a metropolitan for the Turks, and the fact that he's getting ready to anoint one for the Tibetans. We don't actually know if the latter ever took place. So who were these Turks that Timothy referred to? There are several Turkic tribes in Central Asia at the time, as this image from a computer game indicates. You use what you can find. It was probably the Karluks that you see right there in the center, and that does accurately represent where they lived on the steppe north of what's now Tashkent. Several Muslim historians describe how the Karluk capital of Talas, now Taraz in Kazakhstan, was captured in 893 by the Samanid ruler whose mausoleum we saw earlier, after which the church there was converted into a cathedral mosque. Various Christian artifacts have been discovered in Talas, which support the idea of a Christian presence there, including this clay pot, which has the names Peter, spelt Petra, not Petros, as one usually finds, and Gabriel, and again, sort of an abbreviated form of the name as one usually finds, and also the fragment of a clay vessel with a cross on it. So not much, but at least indications that there were Christians indeed in the area. We don't know, as I said, if Timothy ever consecrated a metropolitan for the Tibetans, but there is a Sogdian inscription dated to the mid-9th century from Ladakh in northern Pakistan, accompanied by a cross. The inscription, probably based on the contents, was left by a Buddhist, but the cross definitely was left by a Christian traveling between Central Asia and India or Tibet. And that map shows you where Ladakh is located right in the middle in present-day Jammu and Kashmir. Also of interest is a cross drawn on a Tibetan manuscript with 3 pearls on the tip of each arm. This is very typical of crosses traditionally used in the Church of the East. The manuscript itself contains Buddhist phrases, so we don't know, was the cross an indication of the scribe's faith? Was it actually perhaps somebody else, not a Buddhist, transcribing this manuscript, or had he seen it somewhere? We just don't know. There are numerous other references to Christianity in Central Asia from the 9th and 10th centuries. Ishuddin of Merv, who actually was a bishop of Hadatta in northern Iraq, but came from Merv, was a very important biblical commentator in the Church of the East. Muslim geographers also refer to Christians like Ibn al-Faqih, writing in the early 10th century, talks about the doors on the Church of Samarkand in his list of the most impressive sites on earth. Another Muslim scholar by the name of El-Biruni, who spent most of his life in Central Asia, including his native Khwarezm, which you can see on the map there, gives us important information about Christian festivals from the Nestorians, as he calls them, and the Melkites, who were the Syriac-speaking Greek Orthodox Christians in Khwarezm from around the year 1000. I'm going to skip that one to move to this slide. Writing in 988, the Muslim geographer Ibn Hawqal mentions 3 Christian sites in Central Asia, including a monastery in Sogdiana recently excavated near Urgut, not far from Samarkand. And there are dozens of Syriac inscriptions left on cliffs near the excavated church building, suggesting that many Christians visited the vicinity and held vigil there. Here you can see a shady scholar of ill repute attempting to make a name for himself by reading these inscriptions. There's one of the inscriptions. The name Abdisho is inscribed outside one of the 3 caves. An 8th to 9th century bronze censer with biblical scenes on it was found near Urgut, actually about a century ago. And on the right, you can see a mold for casting crosses, metal crosses found nearby. Amongst the Syriac inscriptions in Syriac script is this beautiful little cross next to the word bakht, Persian word meaning luck or fortune or blessing. Not surprisingly, we have wearable crosses of gold, silver, bronze, copper, nephrite, and bone, dating from the 7th to the 14th centuries that have been found throughout the area of Sogdiana. There's abundant evidence of Christians also around the Tarim Basin in Chinese Central Asia from the 10th to 11th centuries. This satellite image shows the vast Taklamakan Desert that I mentioned before, which makes up the center of the Tarim Basin. This is the site of the what would have been a Christian monastery, from which come the Turfan documents, Christian documents. A couple examples there: a psalter in Middle Persian on the left, and a psalter in Syriac on the right. And I've been told that my time is up. I'll just end by saying that these are 2 other Turfan documents. On the left, a document in Sogdian script containing part of a hymn and a translation into Sogdian of the Nicene Creed. And on the right, a Syriac psalter, which is actually transcribed or transliterated into Uyghur script because the monks at that time could no longer read Syriac, but they still needed to recite the liturgy. More that I would have liked to have shown you, but the time has elapsed, and so I will turn it over to the next speaker.
Our next speaker is Professor Jonathan Loopstra. He's Associate Professor of History at the University of Northwestern in St. Paul, Minnesota. He previously taught at the American University of Iraq, Sulaymaniyah, and at Capital University in Columbus, Ohio. He researches the literary and religious culture of the Near East in late antiquity, with particular focus on pedagogy and the recitation of the Bible in East Syrian Christianity. His published works include the first volume of an East Syriac Masorah, an East Syrian manuscript of the Syriac Masorah dated 1899, which was published in 2014-2015. Professor Loopstra.
Thank you again for the organizers and for Dr. Eden for inviting me to give a talk on the subject of the transmission of ancient knowledge. And when she first invited me to talk on this, I was rather flummoxed. Actually, as you'll find, there's a lot of material here with the transmission of ancient knowledge in Syriac. And she assured me she wanted an overview. And so as I tell my students in survey classes, you're going to get an overview at 30,000 feet. But I hope I'll show you some of the peripheries and directions of the transmission of this ancient knowledge and reasons why this knowledge was transmitted in the ancient world. All right, so looking to the region, located as they were geographically and politically, Syriac heritage Christian communities have always found themselves at the crossroads of cultures and at the periphery for the transmission of knowledge. Of course, as you see here, part of the reason for this was that Syriac-speaking communities were found on both sides of the shifting borders of the ancient world. For our topic today, this means that it was fairly easy then for ideas and knowledge to pass from one part of the Syriac-speaking world to the other, across political and cultural borders. This would also suggest, and I would say that Syriac was a valuable medium for the transmission of ancient knowledge, in part because Syriac, if you think of it, has never been the official language of empire, at least in late antiquity. Syriac was not associated with a single empire, say as Latin was with the Romans, or the concept of Romanitas or Romanness. This freedom from association might have allowed for knowledge in Syriac garb to cross regional and political boundaries with relative fluidity. In addition, it might be suggested that this lack of state support for the translations into Syriac may have also played a role in determining which works were translated into Syriac and which were not. That is, without state support, Syriac scribes may have tended to translate items that mattered to them and not items that mattered to the authorities. As my colleague Hidemi Takahashi of the University of Tokyo has recently suggested, this might be a helpful model in understanding why and how Syriac scribes preserved some ancient works but not others. And the example he gives is the dearth of translations of geographic material we find in Syriac, possibly because they had not the need to be able to rule over long and complex regions. So where should we go first? Let's look at the types of knowledge that we've begun to find in Syriac. And at first it might be worth considering, as I put it here, echoes of antiquity. That is, worldviews, concepts, genres that Syriac scribes inherited as part and parcel of their ancient world. If you will, ideas they breathed in with the air in the early periods of Christianity. So first, let's look, one area they inherited is the ancient Mesopotamian world, and we've said quite a bit about this today. One example, one fine illustration of this are so-called dispute or dialogue poems. Many of you might be familiar with. If you're not familiar with them, Sebastian Brock at Oxford has made a case for their connection to ancient Mesopotamia in his 1979 article with a terrific title called From Sumer to Syriac. You might remember this. We have over 50 of these, again, quite often fun poems, dialogue poems, which survive. Often they pit different figures, two antagonists, the Tigris and Euphrates River, or say Death and Hades against each other in this fascinating type of genre. And this genre is continually used, even in Neo-Aramaic, as some of you might know today. Another echo, if you will, of ancient knowledge I might consider are Jewish elements of scriptural interpretation. And this is not surprising because, as we know, early Christians were surrounded by ancient Jewish communities throughout this region. In fact, the 2nd century translation of the Bible from Hebrew, known as the Peshitta, incorporates for some early books elements of this Jewish interpretation. And as many of you might also know, our earliest Syriac Christian interpreters, such as the East Syrian Afrahat or Farhad, or Ephraim of Nisibis, also incorporates elements of Jewish exegesis and interpretation. Thirdly, another echo of antiquity, it might be worth remembering, is that Syriac speakers were heirs to the age-old traditions of writing and speaking the language of Aramaic, as has often been mentioned here. We should keep in mind, then, that by the time the dialect of Syriac emerged as a written language, Aramaic had been in use for well over a millennium. And this is significant for what we're talking about today because in some ways, this antiquity of Syriac is different than when compared to other Christian languages of the Near East. So, for example, in Armenia and Georgia, and to a certain extent Coptic, the development of written language is closely associated with the arrival of Christianity and Christianization. But Syriac speakers, on the other hand, inherited a language and linguistic traditions that crossed regional boundaries and have been already transmitting knowledge for well over a millennium. So it's a unique difference, and they knew this. Just some examples. Syriac is first called Urhaya because it originated, we believe, in Edessa in the regions. And this is just a little example of graffiti I shot a few years ago when I visited this town in southern Turkey. And if you look up on top of this pillar, some of you might know it from the town, a pillar that overlooks the city, you'll find a script related to Estrangulo. We also find some very famous old mosaics. So, for example, here you find Syriac, or a derivative, up on this mosaic of Orpheus, again in Greco-Roman. And if you look below, you have another mosaic in Persian garb. So you have, again, Syriac at the crossroads of ancient cultures and civilization. It should also be mentioned along the same lines that Syriac preserves some of the classics of ancient Aramaic heritage. Most notably, for example, part of the story of Achikar, the Assyrian sage, which is preserved in Syriac translations in 5 different recensions. And we could also mention other legends, folk legends, Alexander legends, Sinbad, and others. And it should be mentioned along these lines, for the Church of the East specifically, this Persian or Eastern influence is particularly important. We could spend more time talking about it because it means that they evolved in an Iranian context, and this affects parts of liturgy and parts of interpretation in the early days, as opposed to what happened in the West Syrian communities as well. Other areas of knowledge preservation. It should also be mentioned that Syriac Christians helped to preserve and record the histories and traditions of neighboring Christian communities. So, for example, we have Byzantine transmission, we have Armenian, Coptic communities, and even Martoma Indian communities, as Marx pointed out, that are transmitted. And without these Syriac sources, we would often be the poorer for our knowledge of these neighboring communities. Much of this has to do with the work of Syriac and East Syrian historians. And if we have more time, we could talk at length about the importance of these types of chronicles and world histories in the transmission of knowledge, say the coming of the Mongols, as Mark was talking about, or even the arrival of the Islamic movement. When, for example, the Chronicle of Elijah of Nisibis, you see here a late chronicle, 11th century, fascinating. This is actually a universal chronicle. When you look at the manuscript in the British Library, you find that it actually contains something akin to footnotes from over 60 sources. Only 30 of those, I believe, that we still have sources, we still know what they are, right? So again, these are records of early traditions. But if you think about it, what we've talked about so far means that the Syriac community was heir to the ancient Aramaic traditions of the East. And the majority, though, of Syriac translations from ancient works are actually from Greek, not from other languages. And why is this? Again, there's a number of reasons for this, but let me mention two. For one thing, as Christians, Syriac translators naturally wanted access to many of the Christian writings in the Western Greek world. Again, a quite different perspective than the situation in the East, where there are fewer Christian works written in Persian. And secondly, by the 5th century, Greek was considered a high-status language of the elite. That is, the high profile of Greek learning, combined with the movement of Christians to non-Greek speaking areas, eventually led them to begin translating Greek, even secular Greek material, into Syriac. And so as early as the 5th century, we have non-Christian Greek works beginning to be translated. These include ethical works, collections of sayings literature, geoponica, geographic names, even Aesop's Fables, 6th century BC, which is preserved in 3 Syriac manuscripts, and one of these actually contains 64 of these sayings. So we have a spread of these non-Christian works being translated by the 5th century. And it should be noted that although many of these works were being translated first in Byzantine territories, they quickly moved east. And some have made the point that this was aided by the movement of East Syrians after the Council of Chalcedon and the closing of the School of Nisibis in the 5th century towards the east. And we often know that Persian rulers and officials welcomed many of these scholars and translators to the east. One of the key figures in this movement was a West Syrian by the name of Sergius of Rashina. Again, located in North Syria, we're later told by Hunayd ibn Ishaq that he translated over 30 works of Galen, the ancient Greek writer. And in fact, we're told that he used textbooks that were prevalent in the medical school of Alexandria at the time. Some of his translations of Galen are actually addressed to a certain Theodore. And again, there's division in the scholarly community about who this is, but it's been suggested that he was bishop on the Diyala River, if you know that, it's near the border between modern-day Iraq and Iran. So if this is true, we already know that even in this early stage, we have the movement of Galen into the east by the 6th century. And one fascinating example of this, again, we could talk more at length later on if you're interested. This is a newer finding. This is a palimpsest, which means the text that you see here on my right is actually superimposed over the earlier text that has been erased. And the text on the right are hymns, later hymns. But if you notice on my left, you'll find that when they applied ultraviolet light to this manuscript, they discovered underneath, lo and behold, what? An early 5th century translation of Galen's pharmacological work, Mixtures and Powers of Simple Drugs. Again, we could talk at length about this. There's an article on this, but why is this important? It's important because this Syriac text underneath predates any existing Greek texts. Second, it also shows how later East Syrian translators like Hunayd ibn Ishaq may have used Sergius's earlier translation together with other Greek works in order to translate into Arabic. Again, so fascinating things going on with this. Where did these types of early medical texts go? Briefly, they went to many of the East Syrian schools. One of the most famous for the reception of medical works was Gundashapur in the east, as you see here. This becomes very famous for a medical school that develops particularly under the Abbasid era. But we're also given clues that Khosrow the first encouraged these refugees from the west to translate Greek and Syriac texts into Pahlavi in this early period. We also have indications that in this school that developed here, we have texts coming from in India, possibly China, Mark, to come in and be translated. One of the examples of this by the 7th century is the Indian tale of Kalela Wadimna, which makes its way into Pahlavi and then eventually into Syriac in other forms. So again, a fascinating movement. Moving on in Greek, we have other Greek works, obviously besides medical works, that are being translated, particularly in philosophy and logic. Here again, Sergius of Rashina is an important figure in this movement. But we also should mention we have East Syrian figures such as the Catholicos Mar Abba and also a certain Paul the Persian who are writing commentaries on Aristotle's Organon as well. And so you see, for example, Paul the Persian. We believe that his earliest text was written actually in Middle Persian, not Syriac. He's a very interesting figure. We don't know a lot about him. But all the same, we have a lot of different commentaries. If you look on this chart of Aristotle or the first part of Aristotle's work in Syriac. Why is this? Again, there's a number of different ideas that are floating around about why Syriac writers were fascinated by these early logical texts. Past scholars have argued, and this was the assumption, that a primary motivation for the translation of these Greek logical works was, as one scholar Gotthelf wrote, quote, weapons for the theological dialectics. That is, in other words, in this view, Aristotle was put into the service of the interconfessional debates over Christology. That's one view. More recently, Dan King in Cardiff has questioned this assumption that Greek learning was initially used for polemical confessional uses. As King argues, evidence instead tends to suggest that the pre-Islamic use of philosophy was more pedagogically oriented in schools and other settings. An interesting example of this is actually from a West Syrian, Severus Savoch, another translator, who explains in one of his works why he's translating. And this is worth quoting in full. He says this, it's kind of an argument. The Babylonians were the first inventors of knowledge and not the Greeks, as all the writings of the Greeks themselves testify. And after the Babylonians came the Egyptians and then the Greeks. And I do not believe anyone will dispute that the Babylonians were the Syrians. Those who say that the Syrians can know nothing at all are in great error, seeing then that the Syrians were the first inventors and teachers of these things. So for Severus then, the right to steal from the Greeks has less to do with his defense of a particular Christology and more to do with his right as one of Syriac heritage to preserve and retain knowledge that was built upon his own ancient roots. So it should be mentioned as well that many of these works went specifically, again, to the East Syrian schools. And I want to mention another school in particular, namely to the north, the school of Nisibis, in which we have records of Aristotelian logic coming in. And let me just show you briefly this city. It's still on the border. This is a picture I took a few years ago. Still on the border between Turkey and Syria, even today, as it was Roman, Persian in the ancient world. And if you look here, we're at the ancient church of Mar Yaqub. And if you look, my colleagues there are looking at the lintel of the church. And even here on the lintel, you'll see we have Syriac on one side, and what do we have further on? Again, Greek writing on the other. So again, this is a crossways of culture of languages throughout this region. In his study of the school of Nisibis, Adam Becker has argued that a Neoplatonic Aristotle was, in his words, quote-unquote, retrofitted to older, pre-existing Syriac intellectual frameworks. This is a pretty bad illustration, but I was thinking about this the other day when I was painting my basement. In this case, the Greek Aristotle will be the final paint layer to beautify. You put over the solid primer of the Syriac tradition of Ephraim and others. It's a bad illustration, I know. A better illustration might be, again, that this can be found in the system of logical reading marks we find in the Syriac Bible, East Syriac Bible. And this is also very important because it develops into lexicographical studies, which goes to impact other language tradition. Let me give you an example. All right, these reading dots you see here on the Syriac Bible were used for punctuation, but also intonation and meanings and stress. And scholars still debate whether some of these marks first originated with earlier Greek models or are based on an ancient Aramaic heritage of notation. But we believe that Joseph Chazaya, an East Syriac Makariana and teacher of reading in Nisibis, appears to have taken the basics of this borrowed earlier tradition and put it into a form adding Greek notation as well. Right? So, for example, in many of these reading marks, we find species of discourse also found in Ammonius's commentaries on the enunciate sentence. derived from Aristotle. So in other words, what Joseph was doing in the 6th century here was revising his 6th century Syriac notation in part on Aristotelian terminology. Let me give you an example of this. This is Galatians 4:23 to 30 from one of our earliest Syriac New Testament manuscripts in the British Library. And you can see here many of these dotted reading marks. For example, here, the rakhta that connects two clauses. By the way, none of these are in published editions of the East Syrian Bible. You see here the takhta, the talatha, mark of exclamation. And also then you see here this other mark, the methkashpana, which is actually the marker of the dubitative sense. And when we look at Paul the Persian's Introduction to Logic, his commentary on Aristotle, we find that this is the exact term used in his commentary for Aristotle's logical dialectic. So again, we find methkashpana being brought into the use even in the reading traditions, combined with ancient Aramaic or Greek traditions of tautology or recitation of the scriptural text. When we look at other earlier East Syrian manuscripts, we find the same thing. So for example, here in Morgan Library in New York, what do we have? The methkashpana. Remember, this is the same word used for the Aristotelian text. And again, we have similar dots used for the recitation of the Bible. Again, so what does this mean? It means that we have, again, these reading dots in the Syriac Bible itself. They're brought forward with the native Aramaic influences, modified slightly by the introduction of Greek philosophical concepts to form this hybrid system. And many scholars believe this system of dots was later adopted by Sogdians, but also by Hebrews, and also possibly by Arabic linguists as well. So this leads us to the Islamic era. Right? And so in the Islamic era, this is where we begin to see the appropriation of Greek philosophy into confessional debates. And this also leaves us with, as Mark said, Catholicos Timothy I. And in his letters, this is where we find the beginnings of the understanding of the Greco-Arabic translation movement, which eventually will result in the translation of hundreds of works of Greek literature into Arabic, through many times the medium of Syriac as well. And Timothy himself attests to the prevalence of Greek literature in his world. So for example, in his letter to the students in Mosul, at one point he writes that the Syriacs had become inheritors of logic and of orthodox teaching. That is, logic, Aristotelian logic, many of the works which he lays out in his letters, but also orthodox teaching, by which he means the writings of the Greeks, all brought into Arabic. And lastly, we leave you with Hunayn ibn Ishaq, the far end of this translation movement. So in his works, again, over 100 different works that translate the knowledge of the Greeks into Arabic, using earlier sources such as Sergius of Rashaina, and eventually his own works will be published in the libraries of the West. So this brings us full circle then back to Greece and back to Europe, where Hunayn ibn Ishaq becomes an acknowledged medical authority and doctor in his own right. So thank you very much.
Our third speaker is Tala Jarjour, is assistant professor in the Department of Music Anthropology at the University of Notre Dame. She spent the academic year 2015-2016 at Yale University as a senior fellow of the Institute of Sacred Music and visiting assistant professor in the music department in the spring of 2016. Her forthcoming book is under contract with Oxford University Press with the working title Chanting Blessed Edessa, Syriac Spirituality and the Economy of Musical Aesthetics. She will be a speaker at the Gates Cambridge biannual 2016 event on a panel titled Heritage in Peril. Now, the two speakers, the first speaker spoke about the Church of the East and along the Silk Road network, and the second, the Church of the East and transmission of ancient knowledge. Now it culminates, the third speaker, with Syriac chant as a cultural heritage, rightly so. Please.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And for the invitation to be here. It really is a great pleasure. Yes, indeed, my talk moves us fast forward in history to the current time and to current concerns about the future. So we're moving forward very quickly in time. I'm just going to take a second to set things up here so that I can put my computer. If this can move backwards, just. That's great, thanks. It's lovely. Yeah, that's good. Thank you very much. Right, so I should also apologize because we were supposed to have somebody who would give a chanting presentation or demonstration, but he was unfortunately not able to come, and I was informed of that just as I arrived. So I'm not going to sing, but hopefully, if there is time, I will play an excerpt at the very end. I'd be happy to do so. So what I'll be doing today is talking about Syriac chant as cultural heritage from the perspective of projects of collection and preservation. So there's a lot of concern about the living communities, and I should also give a very brief caveat about the fact that my specialty is Western Syriac chant, so Syrian Orthodox chant, but I'm hoping that my talk today will be rather comprehensive. So thus far, the typical way in which Syriac chant has been treated as cultural heritage has been through a small number of recording collections, most of which belong to some form of archival preservatory undertaking or another. In this context, the concept of archive appears and is rather strong and is more overarching than it might be considered in particular projects. As such, I use it today in a general sense in reference to existing forms of Syriac chant collection and preservation. The concept of archive is an independent discussion in its own right, which I will not have the chance to fully address today. What I do hope to do, however, is pose questions. I will not provide answers simply because I don't have them, but those are important questions to state because my rationale in thinking about cultural heritage problematizes issues of meaning and value, especially in relation to the people whose heritage is at stake, and more specifically, to their pain. I want to think about creating collections of a musical cultural heritage as an undertaking that takes place in conjunction with and because of the pain of others. So allow me to put forward a number of questions that inform my interrogative thoughts on the matter. Those title-type statements, as I said, will not be unpacked in the next few minutes. The issues they entail are far too many, but the following discussion makes more sense in light of them. The purpose of a music collection or archive, the reasons behind the existence of an archive, the politics of building an archive, the ethics of election, the politics of inclusion and exclusion, the significance of what is cast aside, why, by whom, and how, the aesthetics of preference, the economies of choice, and the list goes on. Take Walter Benjamin, for instance, who created his own personal archive. According to him, the action of archiving involves keen awareness of, quote, strategic calculation and ethos of an archivist, both of which comprise intentional components of a constructed posterity. On another note that happens to come from Germany, we are talking about archives after all, archives are a historical matter. The creation of archives, such as those of East Germany, for instance, have a bearing on the development of Eastern German cultural history and scholarship. Not only are the material of such archives reflections of the directions in which this scholarship progresses, they are part and parcel of the construction of official histories, as well as the contemporary understanding of complex issues of the past, namely the construction of the past. But I digress. Let me return to Syriac chant. From a wide perspective, my paper is concerned with theorizing the operation and context in which Syriac chant has been and is being documented, archived, and, as many would have it, preserved. The trend of safeguarding the musical traditions of Eastern Christianity in general is not new. Indeed, examples of it date back to the earliest written accounts on the subject, but the sense of need for safeguarding has gained increasing urgency in recent decades, more so in the recent handful of years, owing to the number of recent conflicts that have struck the Middle East, leaving a particularly detrimental effect on its Christians. While I will not be putting particular emphasis on Syriac chant, while I will be putting particular emphasis on Syriac chant, my proposition applies to Eastern Christian traditions in general, and possibly more. Over the last 200 years or so, since the first European written account of this ancient Aramaic oral tradition was published using music transcriptions, many an account have attempted to capture its musical sounds and norms. Some accounts pursued systematic analysis, systematic as in systematic musicology, for the purpose of which they created hundreds of transcriptions. Examples are Husman and Janan, while others deposited samples of Syriac chant in sound archive collections, such as the Berlin Phonogramm Archiv and Le Musée de l'Homme. Whether with the explicit purpose of creating an archive or not, and this would apply to Eastern Christian music as it would to any, documenting or conserving a musical tradition is a process involving a number of tasks. One of these tasks is selection. Since it would be difficult to include every piece and/or variation of a piece in a given collection, no matter how representative a sample may be, it remains a sample that is created by a process of selection involving election and elimination. Choices such as what goes in and what stays out of any collection may be informed by a varying number of factors. Those factors range from the availability of material to the accessibility of sources, the ability or willingness of source guardians, the technical agility and available technological capacity, personal and collective taste, philosophical approach, ideas held to be important, aesthetic considerations, and the relative value of the selected material, to name only a few. One level of these decisions may be made by the tradition bearers, in the case of say, a vernacular musical tradition, or by such source owners as book or manuscript collectors, both of which I implied earlier under source guardians. Another level of the decisive selection process is the prerogative of the collection builder. Thus, one might imagine a given musical collection as a construction constituted of various elements which an architect of sorts, the collector, selects and puts together to form this thing he or she will call a collection. This process involves a creative or a curatorial level of decision-making, which is essentially a work of design. So two main components of the process of creating collections are selection and design. Put together, selection and design constitute a process of representation. Now, what I am concerned with today is the point at which memory, history, and experience interact with the individual, the collective, the process of collection, and the collection as end product. I look at this point in Syriac chant through one particular perspective, that of pain. I want to ask questions pertaining to conceptions of the authority of representing musical traditions, which fall now in a severely endangered cultural category. Those cultural categories are endangered because their bearers, the Christians of the Middle East, are facing dangers to their existence as such. At the risk of redundancy, I point out that inherent to this state of endangerment is a human state of being, namely pain. Put simply, but not simplistically, thinking about the authority of representing cultural heritage involves such questions as who represents whom, what, why, how, where, by which means, and to what ends. I shall hope to touch on some of these questions in the remaining minutes by offering brief comments from philosophical and anthropological works that have discussed issues of archives, agency, and pain, the three essential elements to my discussion of the authority of representation. My aim is to contribute to a thinking about cultural representation which employs multifaceted perspectives and does not shun the complexity of the contexts from which such projects extract the music, but embrace it with aware sensibility, or should I say sensitivity. Let me turn next to the what, the collection. In this time and age of digital media and ease of information dissemination, the creation of collections, a task which once required efforts on institutional and even national levels, is now fully feasible with modest means, namely basic computing material and a decent amount of dedication. Take the case of Syriac chant, which, to my knowledge, no single library has yet attempted to compile in any comprehensive sense. With a simple internet search, one can find a staggering number of websites offering diverse choices of chant samples in a variety of categories. Looking at them, one is struck by the so-called democratic character of the process of collecting this ancient Aramaic tradition. Most websites containing collections are created by individuals from their private collections. However, by going just a little under the surface, one would notice that most of these acts of collecting, ordering, and dissemination create an archive of sorts. And in many cases, the individual websites actually state the explicit purpose of creating an archive. So here are some thoughts from philosophy, specifically from Derrida's discussion on archive and implication and its implication on authority. By the way, Derrida's relevance to the issue of archive, pain, intimacy, and contestation of ownership, rights, and authority is a worthwhile matter that I will also not be able to get into. In the opening of his book, Archive Fever, Mal d'Archives, Jacques Derrida writes, "Let us not begin at the beginning, nor even at the archive, but rather at the word archive, and with the archive of so familiar a word." End quote. He then reminds his reader that arche, the Greek word, names at once the, quote, commencement and the commandment, end quote. This name coordinates two principles in one. The principle according to nature or history, there where things commence, physical, historical, or ontological principle, but also the principle according to the law, there where men and gods command, there where authority, social order are exercised. In this place from which order is given, nomological principle. So the idea of creating a collection necessarily implies a claim to authority, which brings us to the question, who? The differences between a member of the Syriani community creating an online archive of their church songs and a Western academic institution creating an archive of the chant of the Syriac-speaking church, for instance, is worth noting. The full question in this case is not only who is collecting, but also whose music are they collecting. I will not go into post-colonial issues such as Orientalism, but I will suffice the current discussion with mentioning them passingly as I just did. What I would like to dwell on is the ethical, or to complicate things a bit more, the premise of authority inherent to the process of representing the pain of others. To anchor my discussion in relevant scholarship, I refer to anthropologist and theorist Dalal Asad, particularly his work on agency and suffering. In this article, Asad puts the term agency under a new set of analytical tests, commonly used to express the assumption by the weak, the victim, of a voice or an ability of some act of resistance, or mere resilience, the term agency has been confined to, by anthropologists, Assad notes, to assume self-empowerment and responsibility in giving agency a triumphalist vision of history. He criticizes this view and says that rather than consider that seeing agency within individuals or groups who have been on the receiving end of injustice, disempowerment, or, most importantly, pain and suffering, as a form of self-fulfillment, triumphalism of liberated individuals, agency can include creative forms of existing through pain and, as he puts it, ways to live sanely in a state of inevitable suffering. Agency in this sense is not only not triumphalist, it is also not passive or defeatist. It is the way in which such groups as the impoverished Shia of southern Lebanon command a spirituality that embraces pain through rituals based in mourning and self-flagellation practices, but also through forms of emotional and social solidarity, essential to which is their combined view of faith, suffering, and active collective forms of support. In a similar vein, he sees the emotional and moral affect of cassette sermons in Cairo's massive Muslim conscience as the bases for a moral construction of collective agency in which suffering and spirituality are part and parcel of a pious ethical form of existence. Through such examples as the two studies on Shi'i forms of piety in southern Lebanon and the Islamic counterpublics of urban Cairo I just mentioned, Assad offers an interdisciplinary analysis of a number of accounts from mythology, literature, ethnography, and religion, shedding light on agency in history as collective memories of various local pasts. In these states of existence and collective creation of memory and religious experience, pain, representation, religion, and the sense of the collective feature prominently. So let me tie things up together to conclude. Preserving cultural heritage by creating historical sources for an oral tradition that is as steep in history as history itself is, to many, akin to creating an archive, a collection of sorts, a collection of memories and sounds of pain. In embarking on such a process of representation, one must pause and ask some difficult questions. Whatever the answers, if available, one can no longer be satisfied with what to record, where, how, and when. As humanity is thinking and rethinking its conception of purposefully created collections, what we traditionally call archives, we have started thinking about archives in nuanced and increasingly sophisticated, dare I say even sensitive, ways. There are studies about personal archives, such as Derrida's, creations of archives as works of art. Recent scholarship talks about archiving the body, or the body as archive, about power relations and the dynamic nature of archives, the materiality of archives, even the silenced archives. Perhaps, then, the question I want to ask today is, how do we account for pain, even if only in the sense of historical circumstance, when we attempt to capture what we perceive as an endangered musical tradition? Wouldn't we risk sentencing those few left to doom by deciding to devitalize, to dehumanize their spiritual song, the tradition they carried through over 2 millennia of human presence, historicity, and faith, in being primarily preoccupied with how to convey it to recorded objects? To be sure, necessitating its death in the process of deciding to mummify a tradition is neither the aim nor the purpose. But perhaps by thinking more dynamically about traditions which live through pain, then, rather than trying to capture their last throes, we might promote their life and the continuation of their dynamic existence. Thank you.
We have 15 minutes for questions, and please address the panelists, and of course address what the contents of the papers, but please go ahead. Who's the first to ask you? Yes.
Thank you. As someone who's a total novice about the Syriac chants, could you very briefly describe their origin?
Their origin.
Origin, yes.
You couldn't possibly have asked a more difficult question. Help me out, please, historians. In musical terms, this is in the Western tradition. Again, there are more people in this room who know a lot more about Eastern traditions than I do, but in the Western tradition, there has never been a used, at least, and employed form of notation or transcription. So the music has always been an oral tradition, which means that it has always been kept as closely and as faithfully as the people who have kept it have made sure it was kept. So this leads to people saying it sounded exactly the way it did 2,000 years ago, even more for people who who relate the tradition to older times. And it also says that the music itself has been much subject to memory and what memory does. This is a huge discussion. There are many factors that played in its development and its changing over time. There were many cultures that were mixing, as we heard, only on this panel. So musical influences went in and out in various sorts of ways and directions. So this is a very, very complex question. What is certain is that people have put their sacred texts to music, to musical sounds that they, or to ways of chanting that they considered very valuable and very important. And that is the reason why it survives today. And if one observes living tradition, as I do as an ethnomusicologist, I am continuously struck by how strongly and importantly people feel about keeping their music alive. Where it came from, how it changes, those are questions that can be addressed in various forms of ways. So I'm sorry to have not answered your question by trying to answer it, but this is the best that we could do.
Can I answer from the Eastern perspective a little bit?
Please.
Yeah. In addition, I agree wholeheartedly with what you say. In the Eastern perspective, it's interesting. We do have from early histories accounts that there was something akin to a musical tradition. We have, for example, West Syrians who go into an East Syrian village and accuse them of corrupting the minds of the youth by getting them to chant certain melodies, and these types of things, which we don't know how true that is. But one interesting thing is, again, those dots I pointed out, we see those in the Syriac Bibles, East Syrian specifically, all the way from the time of Joseph Chazaya in the 6th century all the way forward. So something happened there, and these are retained until the printing press. And some scholars have argued those dots signified ancient Aramaic hand motions for music. They call it chironomy. Again, we don't know how true that is. It's a debated point. Others argue it comes from the Greek, like Aldebart Merckx. And I think the answer is somewhere in between. But what's interesting there is eventually these are modified, as I mentioned, and they are continued in Syriac scriptures over time to the point where even some earlier Byzantinists have argued these in Syriac represent ekphonetic neumes, may have even influenced Byzantine neumes, meaning then you would have some type of chanted scripture here retained for over a millennium, or the indications that it occurred. So if that's true, then the East Syrian scriptures might have been chanted. If these are neumes, they might have been chanted from this period onwards, although they later forgot what they actually meant. But yeah.
Other questions?
Oh, could I just add to that, just to mention that we have those musical recitation marks in bilingual Syriac Sogdian lectionaries from Turfan, where they have so obviously they were following the chanting marks all the way over there in Western China as well.
For example, along those lines, you can look at the Sogdian Romans, and you can actually see the Tahtaya de Talath, the 3 marks of possibly exclamation or raised intonation, on the exact same scriptural passages in Sogdian that you would have in the East Syrian Bible. So something's happening there. Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to ask Mark Dickens in particular about the excavations in Central Asia that are turning up Christian, specifically Syriac materials, or Christian in general. And I wanted to know that given that ISIS is blowing up anything that is either Christian or even ancient Assyrian today, how do the Central Asian governments, which are basically Muslim, deal with these excavations that unearth a Christian past?
Well, the thing about most of the Central Asian governments is that they are more post-Soviet than they are Muslim, and so their main concern actually are anything like Daesh or ISIS, that Muslim terrorism. That's their biggest concern. So. They tend to clamp down on those people. More troubling is the fact that, for example, that church I showed you that was excavated in Urgut, my friend who did the excavation, once they had taken all the pictures, they then had to cover it back up. And so there's bricks lying around. It's next to a rural farm. There's a sign saying that it's a protected archaeological site. There's nobody guarding it, so anybody could walk in there and do anything. Not that I think anybody would, because most people probably living in the area, it just doesn't mean anything to them. This is one of the problems, of course, when you have a cultural heritage where you don't have people still living there that have any sense of ownership of it, that it then becomes kind of meaningless. In China, same thing. Places like Turfan, if you can get the Chinese government involved in them thinking that it would be good for them to have this place excavated, then they might do some more excavations. But they would probably be more interested in looking for evidence of Chinese, cultural heritage rather than Syriac.
Go ahead, ma'am. Yes.
I was curious about the fact that Christianity seems to have been taken directly, a descendant of the earlier god worship of whatever the earlier gods were. I don't know anything about this history. And I'm accustomed to thinking of the Christian tradition as coming out of the Jewish tradition. And I think you finally mentioned the Jewish tradition somewhere, that there were Jewish communities around where this was happening. And since the Messianic tradition is so central to Christianity, I'm wondering where that originated, since it seems, did the previous non-Jewish ancestors of the Christian tradition in the Syriac areas, where did they get the Messianic ideas from? I hope this is relevant.
Who's going to answer?
So you're asking how did the Christians get the Messianic?
Because I'm used to thinking of it coming from the Jewish tradition, which seems to have been eclipsed or kind of vaulted over in this business from the earlier gods right to Christianity.
One of the interesting things in the study of early Syriac Christianity is that we really don't have the evidence for what was actually happening on the ground, say in places like Edessa. There must have been a Jewish community alongside a growing Christian community, but the question is, was the Christian community, maybe in your words, like Messianic in some regard, or did they cut off from Jews, or were they separate? This is a big issue that's being discussed and debated. Think, for example, what I mentioned with the Syriac Bible, right, the Peshitta. The question is, it was translated from the Hebrew we know in the 1st or 2nd centuries. Did non-Jewish Christians know Hebrew well enough to be able to translate that? Probably not. Was it Jews who translated the Hebrew for the Christians? Well, or was it Jews who weren't quite defined, or were this middle ground between Judaism and Christianity that knew enough Hebrew to translate for the Christians? And so there's a debate on that. The questions of what was happening on the ground in the 1st and 2nd century are hotly debated. But the point is that it's very interesting when you look at Aphrahat and Ephraim. They're familiar with Jewish traditions. Sebastian Brock has written a lot, for example, on the use of Talmudic literature interpretations in early Christianity and early Syriac. So they're definitely living side by side in some ways. This is a continuum of thought. But at the same time, if you look at, say, Aphrahat's writings, while he uses the types of interpretation you'll find in Jewish literature at the time, he also uses it against the Jews, right? So you have him using the very tools against those that are competing for the faithful in this period of time. And you could go on with Ephraim and some of his other memra on Mani and what's happening in Edessa as well. So this is in between area what was happening in the 1st and 2nd centuries. But there is again, evidence that there was conversation going on.
Right.
Another question, I'm very interested in scripts and how the writing system has, and for both of you. Obviously, the script of Syriac was very influential in various Iranian languages and also some Turkic. So I'm curious to see both in Pahlavi and then Sogdian, Khotanese, and other languages, the role of the Syriac script in preserving actually a lot of Iranica or Persian related heritage, and also the role that the Persian empires or dynasties may have had, both in the pre-Christian era in the propagating of Aramaic, as well as also after Christianity and the use of the Church of the East or Church of Persia, essentially its role as it went through the empire. So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts, looking at it, how it impacted the Persian world or the Persian-speaking or Iranian-speaking peoples. Thank you.
This is the last question because everybody's hungry, okay? Go ahead.
Okay, so just briefly, pretty much all of the Iranian scripts were based on the Aramaic alphabet before Syriac had developed as a separate alphabet. So Pahlavi, Sogdian, from Sogdian came Uyghur, from Uyghur came Mongolian script. Khotanese was actually often written in the Brahmi script from India. But as far as the Syriac script that was carried eastward, the languages that were used to the Christian to produce Christian material in using the Syriac script were Sogdian. So Sogdian Christian material is found both in the Sogdian script, the native Sogdian script that comes directly from Aramaic, and in the Syriac script. And also Turkic material is found both in the Uyghur script, which is dependent on the Sogdian script, which is dependent on Aramaic, and in the Syriac script. And there are a couple of fragments in New Persian, which are also written in the Syriac script. But the only Middle Persian material we have is that Psalter, and it's only in the Pahlavi script.
Yep. Let's give them the speaker a close. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.